What's up, everybody? It is Monday, July 10th, 2017. This is Radio Tokyo. I'm Jonathan, and we're not going to do the fun interview today because we're going to talk about something that's actually relevant to society. Not like I know we talk about relevant things sometimes, like politics and police shootings and stuff like that, but I want to talk about something that I'm going to warn y'all ahead of time. You can see from our title card we got right now, it says Context Matters. That's the episode title today. But you'll probably notice the way Context Matters is used, because like what it is of course the Confederate Battle Flag. We're going to talk about something that is a little bit disturbing in a lot of ways, and like probably what you're going to see on screen. Because if you're watching at home, you're gonna get to see some disturbing things. But the reason I'm gonna talk about it is because again, it's relevant. And today, of course, is the 2 anniversary of South Carolina uh, taking down the Confederate battle flag in front of their state house. Something I watched on TV. A lot of people watched it on TV. There was a lot of anger, a lot of outrage about it, and the reason we're talking about it, and the reason I think it's current, and Nick, I'm gonna say hi to you in a second. But the reason I think it's important to discuss this is because the past 2 years have been rather violent in America, race-wise. Not necessarily, full-on race wars or anything, but there's been a lot of anger, a lot of frustration. There's been a lot of protests and arguing and insults hurling, and I think if we don't, like by we I do mean Nick and I and everyone else, like we as a whole, actually start jumping on this shit and getting to the bottom of it, and explaining why certain things are the way they are, and making a better, basically making a better understanding, and moving forward from there, then things are just gonna get worse. Yeah. So with that in mind, hi Nick, how are you?
I'm extremely uncomfortable and wondering how this will go, just like America.
Yeah, you should be uncomfortable because I mean, racism is a thing. It's sadly a thing that we've had to deal with in the United States. But I think I don't know how many times we've talked about historical things. So let me give everyone a little bit of context here. Um, Several years ago, I was a Civil War reenactor. At one point in time, I was a living historian. I was also an interpreter. Um, yes, I have some things that are published. No, they're not very major. They're not like books. It's mostly like a couple articles and stuff. I've lectured in like 4 or 5 states about Civil War stuff. I portrayed a surgeon, and I viewed my role as a surgeon as being someone who would interface with the spectators who were at events, or who could actually better put things in perspective. And the whole reasoning for that is because doctors at that time were like doctors like now. You look at them as a sign of authority. Someone that you respect and everything. Um, and I wanted to be that, and not that I wanted to be an authority figure, but I wanted to be someone could trust and they could speak to about what was going on. And uh, granted, I was not someone who had this like giant hospital tent and every tool possible, but I had a few things that I would carry around, that I would demonstrate, certain things. I would talk about certain things. I would always interact with people and explain to them what a surgeon was doing. Like what a doctor was doing to these people who were fighting in this war. And it was always the easiest thing to explain, and that always led to someone, asking, well, why did this happen? Why did that happen? And while I was learning it myself, I was trying to basically teach everyone else around me. And uh, something I don't talk about that much is that I had family who fought for the Confederacy. I'm genuinely proud that they did. I'm proud my family fought for the South. But here's the thing: that was 150 years ago. Okay, the South then is not the South now. There are a lot of interwoven tendrils in society and comparisons you can make to then and now. Um, and the only one that's really been there the entire time, and it's actually nationwide. Don't let anyone kid you, but it's what we call today racism. Okay, and 150 years ago, someone like me, as a white person, would be aware that there was slavery, that things were different, and that actually has come up more than once at an event. Someone would ask me, well, what about this? What about that? And they would always ask me, like the most profound thing I was ever asked, and I do mean genuinely ever asked at any event, was, what about a doctor treating the wounds of a slave? And like it kind of fucks with me to talk about this. But yeah, doctors treated slaves. Now, it wasn't some overly widespread. Like, for example, you would never see a white doctor go specifically to a slave cabin to treat a slave who had been whipped. It was usually done what we call today in house. Like, the other slaves would take care of them. But it happened. There were physicians who took care of slaves, and the reason I say it really does kind of throw me is being asked something like that kind of puts into perspective. Oh shit, it actually humanizes everyone on either side. And of course, the first thing for, like, the first part of a Hippocratic oath for doctor is do no harm, and that's essentially how I viewed a physician, or what they should be ideally. And that just, like I said, it gives me a unique perspective. So whenever I
Well,
talk about something, I'm talking from that perspective.
I think what's interesting is it would doctor on whether they would actually, um, like you said, usually it was handled by other slaves. It would be fairly rare, but rather rare for a white doctor to treat a slave. Um, of racism and associated with them.
I mean, it would be a rarity, but at the same time, it happened. And that's why I think what we're talking about right now is important. And, like I said, if you're watching at home, you're getting to see the flag coming down. Like I said, this happened 2 years ago. And the reason it's important to discuss it to me, and the reason I want to use, my perspective on history and everything that I know, everything that I've ever learned to talk about this, is because holy shit, there are some misunderstandings about what happened in the war, some of the causes that led up to it, and Nick has seen me, like make like some kind of Facebook status, whatever, and talk about something that's happened. But one of the things that I have consistently said, that's never stopped, is that taking down these monuments, taking down flags, and changing the name of schools and streets, and judging someone for them being named for someone, like Jeff Sessions' name is Jefferson Beauregard Sessions. Judging someone for their name, that's not helping. Like that's not actually going to change anything that happened, and that's, like, keeping all that in mind, that's how I would interact with people. And, like, that's the way I think people need to learn about things, because
Well,
there is, like, just like it's oh,
okay, my perspective is slightly different coming from Maryland. I mean, it's a middle state. We're still southern in a lot of ways, but we also have a lot of northern influences. But many people, especially not from the South, see is that and or having the Confederate flag up or things like that. Ignorance of the history, but in many ways, and this can be largely seen in reactions to removing some of these things, is that it's a glorification of Confederacy and the South and things like that. Many of these people are seen as heroes of the South for various reasons, and certainly some of them could be seen as such, were brave and did have good intentions and did do good things, but a lot of them, I don't want to say their history is whitewashed to a certain extent, but a lot of people overlook, or it feels like a lot of people are overlooking things that are also associated with them. And I think that's important in this argument is if you are going to leave these monuments up and things like that, people aren't learning the whole history behind these people. They aren't learning all the bad things associated with them, usually. It's just what they're famous for, what they're being celebrated for.
Well, see, that's the thing. Like that's like I said, like with the episode title, context matters. Okay, and the whole reason, and Nick had no hand in picking the episode title or the topic for this. This was all me because I want to talk about this. Um, like this is one of those things that I think Nick, out of everything we ever talked about on the show, I think I want my fucking thoughts to be there forever about this because it's like it's important. You know, context matters. And the reason I'm saying that is because 150 years ago, some of the things that we view today as like cut from whole cloth wrong are actually were a way of life. Um, and it is important, you know, that people understand these things. Like Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, he gave a speech known as the Cornerstone Speech. The reason it's called the Cornerstone Speech is because it's essentially the speech that gives the foundation of what the Confederate government was. So I want to read uh, this one, this one quote. This is the most important quote of all. Keep in mind, this is a speech. You can find it online. Again, Cornerstone Speech. Uh, this underlines what the Confederacy was about. This is how it's viewed then, and this is not going to be the full thing because it's very long. Okay, anyway, he said the new Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution, African slavery, as it exists amongst us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. And he goes on to say the Constitution, it is true, secured every essential guarantee to the institution while it should last, and hence no argument can be justly urged against the constitutional guarantees thus secured, because of the common sentiment of the day. Those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. There was an error. It was a sandy foundation, and the government built upon it. Fell when the storm came and the wind blew. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. That is, again, the speech that gives the foundation of what the Confederacy was about. But that's where context matters. Because you notice in the speech, he talked about that being what set it off that time, like the most recent thing. Because, surprise, it's been an ongoing issue for our country. This is not something that is just popped up all of a sudden. It's like, oh, hey, look at us. We're suddenly racist. No. He's specifically talking about South Carolina having ceded, and that's why it's fucking important to talk about South Carolina taking the flag down. And first off, I want to say as glad as I am South Carolina did, as amazing and wonderful it is that Nikki Haley, when she was governor, decided to move the country, excuse me, the state into the future, acknowledging they had a hurtful past, it was the wrong thing to do. There's a reason for that, okay? South Carolina obviously, if you know some basic history, you know South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union in 1861. Actually, it was 1860, whatever. And what South Carolina did was a repetition of something that was tried 10 years earlier. And it was something that was tried about 15 years before that. South Carolina has tried to secede multiple times for various reasons. The first two were over tariffs that were introduced by the federal government. And what it would do, it was a protectionist tariff, and basically what it was intended to do was protect American businesses in the North from being undersold by people in Europe and whatever, because England was really trying to get on our good side and trying to get us to not be buddy buddy with France in the 1820s and so. And so that's what the federal government did, and it pissed a lot of people off. Now, the thing with the tariff was, uh, by the time it was finally finished being negotiated, John C. Calhoun, Vice President of the United States, quit his job. His first one to ever quit his job, because the president, Andrew Jackson, of all people, Andrew Jackson was saying to South Carolina, "Shut up, sit down, shut up. We're trying to figure this out. We're on your side. Quit talking about secession. Quit talking about breaking apart the Union. It's a terrible idea." Now, that is not word for word, but that's essentially what Andrew Jackson said. And, like, that's one of the greatest things about Andrew Jackson. For as terrible a person as he was, that was one of the greatest things about him. But what the tariff did was it added, I forget how much money. Well, initially it was an X amount of money, and the way it worked, and okay, how can I unbox this and it makes sense? Basically, slave-produced goods were taxed when they were sent up north. Okay, the owners of the plantations and basically the people who produced cotton, coffee, whatever they produced on their plantation would send it up north. It would be taxed. Interstate commerce was actually taxed, and that's something that people overlook. But when the protectionist tax was put in place, what it did is it increased the rates of taxes. And you know the whole taxation is theft thing that we have going on today. Thanks to libertarians for that shit. Um, it that's how it was viewed, and it made people genuinely angry. The state that was affected by it most was South Carolina. It nearly destroyed the economy of the entire state. And keep in mind, leading up to that, South Carolina was one of the wealthiest states in what became the United States. It was one of the single wealthiest states. It actually had been from the Revolution onward, but actually before that. Um, so it was viewed as an unfair business practice on behalf of the government. The government is regulating business. It's telling people you're going to pay this, you're going to pay that, and it had to be worked out. And South Carolina's response to that was to threaten fucking secession because they were tired of taking shit from some Yankee up there or whatever. And you fast forward a few years, it comes up again. It's another issue. It's another issue. And then by the time you get to the Civil War, you have the Cornerstone speech. You have the Ordinance of Secession from South Carolina saying it's about slavery. And if you back things up, even though the first two secession attempts by South Carolina don't actually say it's over slavery, it's about slavery. And that's where I have a problem with someone says the Civil War had all these underlying causes. What about taxes? What about this? What about that? Okay, the number one thing, and Nick, if you want to jump in here at any point in time so I don't bogart the whole show, that's fine. But the number one thing that people bring up is, well, it was about states' rights. Okay, states' rights to do what? Every ordinance of secession from South Carolina, Louisiana, Arkansas, Virginia, Texas, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, every state that left the Union, every one, all mention slavery. Like it's there, flat out, it's there. And it's a sentiment that, just like in the Cornerstone speech, is that black people are inferior to white people and they deserve to be enslaved. That's because it was the way of life. And that's why I said my perspective as someone who's a doctor is important, because I'm helping to translate, you know, the purpose of the entire war, and that's what it was. It's unfortunate to say it, but every single issue that you could find that someone from the South wanted to bring up and say, well, this is what we're fighting for, it all revolves around that. Even with people who say that, like, my family didn't own slaves. They didn't fight, so someone else could keep their slaves. But in reality, they fought for a government that was built on the foundation of owning other people. So, yes, my family, by extension, did fight to preserve slavery because Texas wanted to preserve slaves.
And it, I kind of understand why keeping these things up is important for history and to teach history. At the same time, doing so is doing more harm than good because I, I I think from an ideal perspective, I agree with you on a large part of these things. That in a realistic way, saying will ever come to fruition because people just don't want to acknowledge these things. Um, like you said, when you ask people from the South, for the most part, not everyone, of course, there are a lot of people that do know the history and do acknowledge the history. They will argue it was states' rights. They will argue it's taxation, and they will or write off the idea of slavery being the main cause of the war. And I just it's so widespread and so part of the culture of the South. Don't think you can separate or teach the actual history to people anymore. It's one of those things where and I think maybe the best example I have is or two. He removed basically all of it to the Nazi regime. They took. I mean, obviously, they still have them in museums and things. And there were other bad consequences to that as well. Many people trying to act like it never happened in the first place, which is also not a great thing to do. It just seems like the longer that we leave these things up, the longer that we have these monuments, the flags, um, that it's actually become more glorified than actually teaching history. What did
See, like,
happen?
that's the weird part. I mean, like, it's a lot of people I know don't think it's glorifying slavery, and let's be honest, slavery is not glorious. There are, of course, now, okay, I don't want to bring it up, but I'm gonna have to, because there is, the whole, Disney's Song of the South. That's encouraging racism. It's blah blah blah. It's pro slavery. Da da da. Have you ever watched Song of the South? If you haven't, it's fucking boring. It's a terrible story. Now, that said, stories like Brer Rabbit and stuff like that, yeah, those are great. Those are wonderful. I like the Brer Rabbit stories. Now granted, that gave us the term tar baby. But yes, I just said tar baby. Okay, those of you who don't know, in the story of Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox, Brer Rabbit is walking along, and Brer Fox, the fox is trying to hunt the rabbit. Basically, like that's the story. So the fox builds a little person type thing out of tar, like actual tar, puts clothes and puts clothing on it. Brer Rabbit walks up to it, says hi, Of course, the little tar baby it's called does not speak back to him, so Brer Rabbit punches it, and he keeps punching it. The more he punches it, the more stuck to it he gets. Brer Fox comes along, asks him what he's doing. He says he's going to eat him, and Brer Rabbit starts begging for his life, all this, all that, da 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 da, and finally suggests, whatever you do, don't throw me in this little briar patch over here. So Brer Fox picks him up, throws him in there. Brer Rabbit, of course, escapes because that's the rabbit's natural environment. And that, in case you're wondering, is where we get the term sticky situation from. Okay, like that's the history lesson here, okay? But Walt Disney grew up hearing these stories, and he decided to make Song of the South. Okay, well, that's great, wonderful. Song of the South doesn't glorify slavery. It does, in a way, talk about essentially what we know today in movies and everything to be the magic black man, um, because that's kind of what happens. But it's no more a glorification of slavery than Gone with the Wind was. It's no more racist than the crows from Pinocchio or someone in blackface or anything else was. It's a hallmark of the time because again, you have to look at it the way it was then and the way we see it now. And like that is the single most important thing that I can tell someone is if you look at a photograph of someone who was enslaved, understand this is a person who was alive. This is a person who then this was their life. Okay? Uh I don't remember who said it. Um but there was it was a statement saying I'm sorry, it was Harriet Tubman who said something to the effect. This is not gonna be word for it. I'm sorry, but that the reason she was so upset that she could not save so many more slaves is that so many people who were slaves didn't know they were slaves. They didn't have the education. They weren't aware that their purpose in life was any possible thing other than having someone who owned them. And that is the most goddamn terrifying thing I can possibly imagine. But at that time, that's the way it was viewed. That is the purpose of what Alexander Stevens was trying to get a point in his speech. I'm sorry, is that this is the way of life. That was how people thought then. We think differently now. But like you hear all these stories about people who wore collars and everything, and yes, there are people who had collars and they had bells and they had chains and all those great things, that you think would be some kind of fun story. Like if you're looking at home right now, like you're watching on screen, you're seeing a picture of a slave who's wearing a collar. You notice the prongs on there? That was to make it so he could never lay down comfortably again. Some of them would be completely outstretched so that they could never lay down. They'd have to sit up, like it was a punishment. And then, of course, you have the slaves who were beaten, who were whipped and everything. And this is where I have a severe issue because one of the things, it's like Nick, you said it was whitewashed. It has been whitewashed. Okay, it's not just it's not just a denial of the inhumanity of what slavery was. It's it is a denial. Like it's like saying the Holocaust didn't happen. How could someone do something like that? Okay, how could someone say that they owned another human being, a person who was capable of speaking and hearing and communicating with you, clearly had emotions, had a family, would be upset, but oh, they're a person. It's because that's the way they viewed this at that point in time. That's the way things were. Okay, but one of the whitewash responses is, well, no slave master would ever beat his slave and would severely wound them. Bullshit. Bullshit. We have the writings of Frederick Douglass, who talked about slaves being beaten. You have Nat Turner's, the people who were around him at that point in time were aware of it. You have Solomon Northup from, the man who wrote 12 Years a Slave. All these people talk about how, yes, there were terribly cruel people, but where the whitewashing comes into play is that a slave was a piece of property. Like trying to equate a person to a car or an iPhone or something like that. And why would you damage that? Because you want it to still work for you, right? You don't want to have to pay money for it. And when you think about that on its basic level, that is the same reasoning that someone would give for why they could own a slave. Okay? It's a piece of property. It works for me. It has a function. It does this. It does that. I don't need to tear it up because it's my property. But at the same time, I've got enough money, I can just go buy another one. And like that is like it's essentially the idea of consumerism. And that is a thought that we only think of in the United States today. This idea that all these, like iPhones and computers and video games and stuff like that, like it's all stuff we can just throw away. We all have so much money we can throw it away, and that's without getting on a rant about capitalism. That's a problem we have in society. But that's the way people look at that. It's like, well, they owned a person. If the slave dies, that's fine. They've got more. And it's fucking horrifying to me and disgusting to me to think that someone will look at this and say, not a big deal. Like it's like getting a new car or a new phone or something, something like that. It's just no big deal. It's fine, whatever.
And
And it's a problem because it is a big deal.
well, one thing to point out is that um, people might associate slaves with how people might treat, which is disturbing on a whole other level. But people would think you treat your pets well. You a cat, whatever. Um, they treated animals better than they treated slaves. Not a lot of the slave owners did. It's much more prized than a slave, horse, or cow. They were more valuable to the owner than the slave because you could just replace the slave very easily, and emotional connection for the most part. Most owners did not like or slaves. There were, of course, exceptions. And I think people latch on to the exceptions too much sometimes. The overriding of African Americans and African slaves was truly pieces of property, human beings. I think it's a difficult concept for a lot of people to grasp onto because most people don't think of Americans in that way anymore. That's not to deny that racism is very prevalent and very strong rooted and the authority complex, the biases, the stereotypes are still there. This part, people actually see African Americans as human beings now, which is a small improvement. Well, I wouldn't even say a small improvement, which is a big improvement from the past. Obviously, there's still a lot of work to do.
There really is, but see, like that's why I kind of wanted to ground today's episode in what happened 2 years ago, because this morning, surprisingly, um, of all things, the South Carolina Secessionist Party went to the state capitol and held a rally. You ever seen a bunch of fat white people in overalls and really bad uh, uh, rebel hats and shit like that, screaming and shouting as someone holds up a Confederate flag? Yeah, that's what happened today. Happened today. Contrast that with 2 years ago. There were no protesters. There were people who were there fucking cheering. And one of the best pictures I've seen is one, I kind of showed it a little earlier. This is from NBC News. This is a picture I took 2 years ago and I watched it. I was watching online, so I just hit screen cap. Um, if you notice there in the background, like just to the right of the flagpole, there's someone holding the American flag upside down. It's because America's in danger. America's being threatened, and like that's the number one response to all of this is that, well, you're taking away my history. Yeah, that's the difficult part. Like that's why educating people about this matters. That's why it's so important that everyone understands that the Confederacy was not some great thing. Now, sure, they fought for states' rights. They fought for doing this. They stood up for everything they believed in. They were willing to protect their homes. All that good shit. It's wonderful that people are willing to do that. Get out and vote. Run people for office. Run for office yourself. Like that's the way the Constitution is intended to work. In fact, the Supreme Court has even ruled on this. Texas v. White, I think is what it was. That why is it always Texas? But anyway, you do not have the legal right to secede. It's illegal. It's unconstitutional for you to break apart the country because that's what the United States is. But like that's the big part here is that people view this as destroying your history. Like when you take down a flag or a monument, and like it's really not. Um, because your history is hurtful. I mean, it
It's
to
not
me.
just hurtful. It's a lie.
It is. It really
And
is a lot. I mean, like to me, being the descendant of someone who fought for the Confederacy, I'm proud that they did. But at the same time, I also think it's terrible. It's genuinely terrible to me that I had someone who was willing to pick up a gun to defend, their state and their home and everything, for this idea that a country was founded on owning other people and that other people were wrong. And that's where the whole dissection of this comes into play for me. Um, there were people who fought not necessarily uh, for slavery or against it. In fact, it wasn't until middle of 1862 or so that freeing the slaves became a genuine war aim for the Union. And that's again where history matters. Like around the time Lincoln starts putting out the Emancipation Proclamation, and everything, um, it wasn't a war aim. It was to preserve the Union. Like that was the single most ultimate cause, and that's why the responses of people like John Letcher, the governor of Virginia, um, are so important because the Confederacy, I hate to say it, didn't secede because of slavery. They seceded because they felt their rights were being trampled on. They were being taxed unfairly. They had been being taxed unfairly. They were being told they could do this, they could do that, and there were these negotiations that had been made, agreements settled that a state in the future would be able to choose whether it was a free state or a slave state. And then, of course, you have like there is a lot of things here. But you had the notion of, like, for example, the Dred Scott case, where is a slave who is taken to another state that is a non-slave state, are they still property there? And just imagine that if you can. If you never read about Dred Scott, read him. Read Jesus. It's terrifying. But the Supreme Court ruled that because Mr. Scott was owned, in his home state, traveling to a state where slavery was disallowed, he was still property. Okay, even if Dred Scott, which he was passed along to his master's spouse when the master dies, and that spouse, the wife, remarries, does ownership transfer to the new owner? Supreme Court's like, yeah, it does. I mean, we're talking about human beings here, and like the reason I'm bringing up Dred Scott is because a few years before this, you had the case of Amistad, and the Amistad trial is fascinating in itself because we're talking about people who were captured in Africa, brought over here on by a Spanish slave ship, excuse me, after the importation of slaves was made illegal by the United States. But they were being brought to the Caribbean, and they were going to be sold and then smuggled here because slavery was again not allowed, to do that. So the trial goes all like you had former presidents weighing in on this. You had the Supreme Court involved, and it went. It was a huge issue because you have these men and women who are Africans, like they're genuine Africans. They've never been owned, but here they've been forced into slavery. Are they the legal property of people in Spain? Are they the legal property of the people who own the Amistad, who were in America? What about the navals? Say, the people in the Navy who found them. What about the jail? What, like anyone involved in this group? And the ultimate decision was no. These people were legally free. They were not owned, and they were to be returned home as soon as possible. So, like, you have here, just within the span of less than 20 years, a case where someone who was born in freedom and forced into it is told you had the dignity and rights of a full person. We're going to leave you alone. But someone who was born property is told you're property no matter what. And like that's again the reason I keep saying context matters, because that's the world all this was happening in. And denying that is part of the past, denying that these things happened and that people look at it that way, is what has led to everything being whitewashed. And there's a workaround for this, and I've had a conversation with someone who thinks that this is a genuine workaround. And the reason I'm going to switch to that rather than kind of staying on the tangent is the reason I said it originally became a war aim for the North, to end slavery, is because it wasn't. The Union was losing. They were they were losing ground. The Confederacy was getting support from France and England and Germany. All those other countries were taking a vested interest in, holy shit, the Confederacy's right. They're doing the right thing. They're making a decent claim. And these other countries specifically said, we're not going to acknowledge you until you can prove that if you're going to fight for what you believe in, essentially, that you have to start winning victories. And the Confederacy was winning. So all of a sudden, this abolitionist movement, like, the people who thought that Lincoln needed to free the slaves automatically and do this and do that, that's when that cause got brought in. And it did lead to the Confederacy's defeat, because the Union, even though they had to start a draft for people, the Confederacy did too, by the way, but even though there had to be a draft, the Union was picking up so many people. And, by late 1862 or middle late 1862, they began training all black regiments. And free slaves and free men were allowed to fight. former slaves basically who escaped, and free men, which for those who don't know, there's free man or freedmen, which is blacks who were never enslaved. Which, by the way, Solomon Northup was a free man until he was captured. But anyway, um, that gave the Union more people to pull from, and then you have Lincoln's push a couple years later to to abolish slavery. And Alexander Stevens' response to this, because he actually met with Lincoln in person, you can look all this up. He met with Lincoln, and the first question he asked him, because this is around the time the 13th Amendment was being ratified by Congress, or being voted on in Congress, rather. Uh, Alexander Stevens' first question to him was, will we be readmitted to the Union in time to stop the ratification? Because these people did not want to give up what had been their way of life. And I understand that, but if you read the 13th Amendment, Section 1 and Section 2, it talks about how uh, slavery and involuntary servitude will not exist except as punishment for crime. That's where we actually get our modern prison system from, or the idea, rather, like people who have chain gangs and everything, and that was something that was pushed during Reconstruction. Well, during Reconstruction and after Reconstruction by the Klan. Like, it was this idea that these people are still separate. They still need to remain exactly how they are. And there were state laws passed. In fact, if you watch the movie uh, Free State of Jones, that's a real event. And it talks about miscegenation laws in different states, or better yet, because this is the 50th anniversary of it, the case of Loving versus Virginia, which was a white man married a black woman, and Virginia said, "No, you're going to jail because you married someone that you're in love with." Like, it's that was the result of it, because it was viewed as improper for a black and a white to ever have a child, and oh my goodness, we can't do that, even though everyone loved like a nice pretty young mulatto woman. Oh, she was beautiful, but it was scandalous. And that's kind of what things went. It went from being, well, it's our right to own these people, to being, it's our right to employ these people and treat them as second class citizens, and then certainly we can never intermarry. And that's one of the things that the Klan, wound up promoting. You can't promote someone, but the reason it goes back to the whole punishment thing is uh, forced labor was a racist thing put forward in Reconstruction, and then during the Jim Crow era, the early segregation years, it was a forced punishment, often put on blacks, and blacks who didn't agree with that were lynched. Like they're executed, just for disagreeing with the system, or because they wanted to do one thing, and they're like, well, we're free people, and then you have these other people, it's always white people, always saying, hey, you can't do that. You need to go back and do your thing. So it's like calling someone boy, expecting a black person to move out of your way, and all these terrible things that people did. And that's all of a result of telling people, like, within a generation or two at the end of the war, that this is the way things are. And that's why, to me, the whole separation issue with the Confederate flag and the symbolism of the Confederacy, it's so hard to remove, because you had this pervasive lost cause mythology. The South was just doomed to lose, but it's fine. The South is still powerful. The South will rise again. Like, just this myth built up
And
around it, that people like.
there's so many myths about the old South, like that the South were full of noble gentlemen, and the
And
South were.
to an extent, there were some noble people here. And what's bothering me,
I'm saying that. Uh, how do I put this? I'm saying that around the South was some kind of utopia of freedom and liberty. exemplify the true ideals of America, and that the North is just greedy. The North is just manners. They don't have. They're weaker than the South somehow. There's just all of these things that are taught in the South, and it's boggling to me. Just
See,
this
like
illusionary history.
it's all part of that idea of sectionalism. You just touched on it. In fact, the people in the South, thought that people up north were inferior. Because essentially everything down here you worked for it. Now either you worked the land yourself or you had someone work for you, but it was a family. It was a sense of um, kinship. It was brotherhood. It was this familiar line was carried on. Like you inherited something. You inherited property. You were an owner of people and things and land because your family was, and you built this up and you built this massive amount of wealth. But the Yankees up north, oh no, they're starting their own businesses. They're having to do things on their own. So like it's a complete split in how things were viewed by people and the reality. And like it's like today, you have this the concept that everyone in the South, they done talk like this. They missing they teeth and they stupid. They ain't even graduate high school. Look at Jerry Springer. Just look at fucking Jerry Springer. That keeps that idea going. That everyone in the South is uneducated. They're poor. They're rednecks. They're terrible. This is all. It's a stereotype, and stereotypes are sadly grounded in truth in a lot of ways, but not everyone here is like that. I'm not. Now, granted, I'll be honest, I've got some missing teeth, but it's genetic. It's not because I drank that corn pone liquor all that time, and I don't want to go lynch somebody. I graduated high school. I'm assuming people think I'm intelligent. I don't know, but whatever. Like it's just a stereotype, and it's brought up continually. It never really goes away, and that's grounded in how people up north viewed people down south. They were wholly different from anyone else. Like the north was more industrial. They embraced technology. Things moved faster, and that's why you had that uh, the tariff put in place that led to South Carolina threatening secession. That was part of it. And then you had it's just all these little things that have gone on since before the revolution even took place, and it's like I said in the beginning, it's still here. Like we have never in the South have never really escaped our past, and we have to, I think,
I,
at some point in
well,
time, learn to walk hand in hand with these ideas and like acknowledge, hey, maybe I'm wrong about how I view things. Like it was a life changing moment for me to realize, hey, this is what I've heard. Like this is just, instead of it being this is the way things are, I realized, well, no, it can be better than that. And like every time I see, someone on TV that's screaming about taking down a monument, or I see someone who's talking about police brutality and all this thing, I'm like, well, shit, this is fucking America. This is just the way things are here, and it really shouldn't be the way things are
um,
here. Just like slavery
I
is a terrible thing.
actually,
Racism is a terrible thing, and it shouldn't be how things are.
well, it's really interesting that you say that because I think problems in history was that never made to admit that it was wrong. It really wasn't. The South always resisted. The South always resisted that they were wrong for their views. towards African Americans. The South always resented the Reformation period. Some ways, and I know any Southerner would hate to hear me say this, hard enough on the South. I don't think part of me really wishes that the North did actually break the South because it's underlying resentment and, like you said, the South will rise again. That's always the rallying cry of the South. They never gave up. The armies might have surrendered, but the South itself never gave up its ideas. It's
But
never gave up.
hang on. There is one important thing to this, and essentially you are wrong. And the reason I say you're wrong is because not everyone here was willing to surrender. Was willing to give up. And that's why you have like the song, "Good Old Rebel." Look it up. I'm a good old rebel. That's just what I am. Uh, and for the Yankee Nation, they didn't give a damn like that song. It's a song that came out post-war. Um, but the pillars of what hold up this, old South mentality, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Jeb Stuart, people like that, uh, they weren't hateful. They weren't racist in the terms we think of today. There's this idea floating around that Robert E. Lee was never a slave owner, and that for some reason, like, there's some information skipping here. Lee was never a slave owner, but what he did was he freed the slaves that worked his plantation, called Arlington, which is Arlington National Cemetery. Which, by the way, in case you're wondering, Arlington Cemetery became that because the government seized it from Lee's family as punishment, surprise, for seceding. Um, Anyway, Lee freed his slaves. He didn't free his slaves until 1862. You notice that? Virginia seceded in 1861, so this is a little over a year into the secession of Virginia that Lee is freeing his slaves. That's because there was a contract in place because his father-in-law owned Arlington at the time, and when his father died, it was in his will that slaves would not be freed. I think it was 8 years. So Lee was a slave owner of slaves he inherited for 8 years. So the idea that Lee never owned slaves is bullshit because he did for 8 years. And legally, he could not free them because he didn't want to go against the will. Okay? But after the war, Lee's immediate response was everybody go home. Put down your guns. It's over with. We lost. And the reason it was because Lee was one of the most humble people ever to live. And he acknowledged, okay, we didn't win. It was God's decision. We didn't win. And he didn't want anyone, to do like partisan tactics or guerrilla warfare and just show up and everything. Like he wanted it to be over with. And after the war, he was willing to work with freed slaves. Like, in fact, there's a story about him being in the church and a slave or a former slave is there, you know, during the sermon, and he gets up and walks to the front, the front altar to pray, and Lee gets up and walks with him. Okay, compare that to Stonewall Jackson. Jackson never owned slaves, never. Uh, he didn't secede to preserve slavery. Neither did Lee. They seceded to defend their homes because at that time they viewed their state as being more important than the country, and that was a pervasive thought. It was defending your family, defending your home, defending your way of life, all these important things. So that's why I said earlier what I said about how my family, by extension, did fight to preserve slavery because they fought for the Confederacy. Okay, but you have people like this, and you have um, just like there's a long list of people that I could name who did these noble, like for example, just
Oh, hold on just 1 second. I disagreeing with you or disacknowledging or not acknowledging that this happened or that these things. But there are more exceptions to the rule than the rule itself. And the most pervasive thing after the war was that despite the wishes of people like Lee, the South held on. The South viewed themselves as an occupied territory,
I know.
and they never.
I was getting to that. Like I was going to give one more example and then get to that. Because this is where my perspective comes in. But what I was going to say is just to kind of ground this in current events. Look at New Orleans. New Orleans took down a statue of PGT Beauregard. And everyone flipped out. Well, how could they do that? They're betraying da da da. Thing is, the Beauregard statue is one of the ones I think. In fact, it's the only one of the four that was taken down that I think should have been left up. Because after the war, Beauregard went home to New Orleans. He was from there. He was proud to be from there. He went home and he immediately began helping with Reconstruction. He worked to ensure that black people the freed slaves were treated equally and fairly by the government of Louisiana, which was decidedly against them. He ensured that blacks would be allowed to run for office. And when New Orleans had its first black public official, he campaigned for this man. Like he went out of his way to help rebuild things. And that was Lee's message. And had Jackson lived, that would have been Jackson's message. But then you have this contrast to, and I really hate to rag on the people, but the Sons of Confederate Veterans, their current person is Nathan Bedford Forrest. Just one thing I want to point out, I had a family member who rode under Forrest's command. I have no idea if they were at Fort Pillow, but they could have been. I don't know. Anyway, Forrest after the war was bitter. He was angry because he had spent his entire fortune on fighting to own people. Like he's a terrible example of what a decent person was. And again, Forrest went on to help found the Klan. There were a lot of people that were like that. In fact, there was someone from the general part of the world I'm from. His name was Walter P. Lane. Walter P. Lane moved into my hometown and formed this group called the Citizens Party. And the Citizens Party would prevent all blacks and all people who were Jews and everyone else from being here. And they took over the city government and continually pushed for federal troops to be forced out. Like there was no government buildings here within the city limits until into the 1900s, like 1910s, 20s, somewhere around there. We didn't have that here. And like when you say that the good people are exceptions, yeah, they really are. Because there were people who did some terrible. That's why I mentioned Jim Crow earlier. That was some terrible, terrible, terrible shit. The anti-miscegenation laws in nearly every state were terrible. They're goddamn terrible to do this to people. And that's part of the past that people need to acknowledge is a thing. It really happened. I mean, there are people who are alive right now who were born, like my parents, were born before before the end of segregation. They were born before the collapse of miscegenation laws. They were born at a time when a black person was still treated differently because they were different. They are different, you know?
And I think this is one of the most interesting things is because when we talk about removing these flags, these statues, these things like that, I'm generally for removing them. I think it's too. It's we both want the same things, and of history, and to teach history, but I view or that these these monuments still remain, that these statues, these flags still remain, as the South not acknowledging their history, the wrong things that they did, and you view it as a necessary thing to, in order to acknowledge that they did happened and the wrong things that they did. And it's really interesting to me because I think in general we have the same goal about the past, and um, get the wrong idea. The North wasn't much better than the South in any regards. The pretense that they fought to free the slaves is weak at best, a lie. Um, it's just completely understand where you're coming from, and I agree with you in a large part. In an ideal situation, in an ideal world where people really did look back at these figures and learn from what happened, think people are ever going to do that as much as I would like them to, as much as
There's
I
no
would
way.
hope that they would. And because of that, I generally think that these monuments need to come down, these statues need to come down if the South is ever going to truly move past the Civil War and move past racism.
Well, see, like that's why I said, like in the beginning, that taking these things down isn't going to change anything. Like you're going to have to educate people what's going on. Like, here's the thing. Here's the thing. I'm all for leaving these things up, but at the same time, I'm all for taking them down. Like the flag in South Carolina, that needed to go. That had not been there since the end of the war. It was put there in the late 50s. It's only been there 40, 50 years, something like that, at most. And there are people who are saying, it's been there forever. It's a symbol of our past, a symbol of this, a symbol of that. No, it was put there as a reminder that segregation was a thing. It was put there for the purpose of white supremacy, which is the reason that the Battle of Liberty Place monument in New Orleans, if you fucking read it, it tells you that the government of Louisiana was for whites. The state was for whites. White power was going to control things, and that's one of the hurtful things to come out of the war is just this anger and this right that even though we live in the best country on earth, that people are still need to be separate here. We need to have separation of races still, and like that's unfortunately what helped fuel the election of our current president is playing on that fear. Whether you're blaming Mexicans or you're blaming Muslims or whatever, you're just building on that same fear, and like that's why I kind of wish a lot of people would look at what's being said and look at what's being done and realize, oh shit, this is kind of a terrible thing to be doing, and it really like you're essentially vilifying people just because of their religion or the color of their skin. That is the most anti-American thing possible. But I think we've probably kind of ground home that that is the most American thing possible. Like that's how we are, and honestly, that's the best follow up I think we can give, to our to our episode on Friday where we talked about, like the duality of people and everything, and how they react, how you can have two sides of everything. Is that's like there's more than one face of this country. But again, to me it's important that people understand, and I realize, Nick, like now that we're kind of at the end of the show, I realize that there is no way that you and I have solved every problem in the that the country's had that we ever will. But if anything, like I said at the beginning, this is why I kind of want my thoughts on this to be down, like somewhere so we can read it and hear it, and maybe, what I like someone who spent the vast majority of my life, especially my adulthood, learning about this, reenacting it, everything, talking about it, educating people about it. Maybe someone will listen to what I'm saying, will be inspired to look into it. Maybe someone will listen to you even. Out of all the things I would ever want someone to be inspired by regarding you, uh, maybe look into what happened and learn about it and realize, like there's an argument for keeping them up because it's preservation of the past. It's a talking point. It's a way to learn. But and take this from a white man living in the South. There are people who are still genuinely affected by this in a negative manner because it's an ongoing thing. Like it's never like we're literally not, like I'm not more than a generation removed from segregation. You know, I know black people who are well, two generations at minimum away from someone who was a slave, or two or three generations, maybe three, who was someone who was enslaved. Like I know some people who can actually trace their ancestry back to the moment that the first ancestor they have here was bought and paid for. It's a terrible thing, and like it's as terrible it is, it's still awesome to realize that we're essentially living right now, um, like stacked on top of the past. And again, I realize we haven't solved this issue, but
Well, I don't know if I've ever told or said this on the show, but trace my history back to slavery, and very easily in Puerto Rico. And like you were saying, as a white man, now I also look very white, but I come from a very varied background, which includes slavery, Native Americans, European descent. But while these monuments and things may be a representation of history to many, they are a representation of fear, of hatred, of um, that it wasn't just how bad it could be, but a reality of how bad it could be. And that's a factor. I mean, certainly being the Confederate flag, or there are some African Americans that have the Confederate flag on their car or whatever, or they wave the Confederate flag, and that's fine. Can't ignore how it affects people either. And for the very large majority of color, in a very negative manner, because that history wasn't just an idea to them. That has, in many ways, carried through past the war, past Reconstruction, past segregation, past even the Civil Rights Movement. We are miles ahead better than where we were in the past. There's no doubt about that. But when people say there isn't racism, or that everything is fine now, that's just ignoring history and ignoring reality.
it's not just ignoring it; it's bullshit. I mean, like it's genuine bullshit, especially when someone says, "We elected a black president. Racism's dead in America. It's over with. Racism was done until Obama." No, no, just stop being a dumbass white person and read some history. I mean, goddamn, you have me, another white person. Now, I know the response if I were to ever say this to anyone like that. Well, you're just a fucking leftist. Sure, call me what names you want to. At least I'm not a racist. And that, I think, is the biggest point to take away from this, is that I've learned the past. I don't mind talking about it, but it's the understanding of the past that lets us move in the future. Like that's why I brought up our episode on Friday. That's in the past, but it connects us it connected us to today, and today will connect us to Wednesday. Um, yeah. Anyway, thanks you everyone for listening to this, and out of every episode we've done, Nick, I would like there to be like some actual comments down in the doobly doo down below. So like if someone's watching, let us know what you think about this. Like so. Uh, yeah, typical ending would be to like this video, comment on it, share it, subscribe it, go to our Facebook page, give us a like there, visit our Patreon, and give us your money. Tweet at me, and for whatever reason, go to Twitch.
Yeah. Have a great Monday night.
It's really weird trying to be positive and upbeat and end the show after all that heavy shit in it, Nick.
Yep.
Oh well, but yeah, that's gonna be it for today. So again, thank you for watching and listening, and we'll talk to all of you on Wednesday.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.